Ranking Member Morelli, members of the committee, and our witnesses for participating in today's hearing. The U.S. Constitution protects the rights of citizens of the United States to vote in our elections. In fact, federal law makes it a felony for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. Most but not all states outlaw non-citizen voting in their elections. American elections are for American citizens, and we intend to keep it that way. Recently, we've seen Democratic-run cities allowing non-citizens to vote in local elections. Washington, D.C., New York, Maryland, California, and others have passed legislation to allow non-citizens to vote in elections. This causes a host of problems for a state to maintain clean voter registration lists. Let me explain. The National Voter Registration Act was enacted to help increase the number of eligible American citizens that are registered to vote. By giving applicants voter registration forms when getting a driver's license, more individuals are likely to register. However, non-citizens here legally are entitled to federal, state benefits, including driver's licenses. That means in some circumstances, non-citizens also receive the same voter registration forms. My concern is that the interpretation of the NVRA makes it difficult for states to maintain clean voter lists. We should be giving states tools to ensure their voter rolls are clean as we approach November's election. Yet jurisdictions allowing non-citizens to vote, like Washington, D.C., are only required to keep one voter list. Maintaining one clean list with U.S. citizens and non-citizen voters presents challenges. Let's take a look at examples of these challenges where NVRA was misinterpreted in Pennsylvania and in Ohio. In 2022, the Public Interest Legal Foundation found Pennsylvania had allowed non-citizens to register to vote for decades. Pennsylvania later publicly admitted that due to an alleged programming glitch, that the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation had allowed non-citizens to register to vote. Last week, Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose ordered the state's voter rolls to be cleaned after a review found more than 100 non-citizens in Ohio were registered to vote. These examples raise serious concerns. In D.C., the Board of Elections says it is on the non-citizen to understand they cannot vote in federal elections. Right now, in our nation's capital, roughly 500 non-citizens are already registered to vote. Let me be clear. Non-citizen voting reduces confidence in our elections. Washington, D.C. is setting a new standard that could soon be applied across the country. We must stop non-citizen voting. That's why our committee passed my bill, the American Confidence in Elections Act. One section of the bill allows states to access federal databases that contain citizenship information so non-citizens can be removed from the voter rolls. As we continue to see foreign actors interested in influencing our elections, our current practices should cause us all concern. Since President Biden took office, over 7 million illegal immigrants have crossed the southern border. We must ensure our elections are secure and running properly without foreign influence. Yet last month, Washington, D.C. mailed this postcard across the city encouraging non-citizens to vote. In response, I sent a letter to the D.C. Board of Elections about the postcard. The D.C. Board is actively hosting virtual town halls, encouraging non-citizens to vote. To vote in local elections in our nation's capital, you only need to reside here for 30 days. That means any non-citizen who moves to D.C. by October 5th can vote in this November's election. If any of the 7 million migrants move to D.C. by this October, they can vote in the upcoming election. In our nation's capital, they don't even need a photo identification to do it. This does not instill confidence in our elections. The Committee on House Administration has broad oversight of our nation's federal elections, including here in our nation's capital. We've passed a bill to require citizenship to vote in D.C. elections. Republicans on this committee are committed to ending non-citizen voting. We'll also discuss the role of foreign nationals play in our elections by contributing to nonprofits. Federal law prohibits foreign nationals from contributing to campaigns. However, we have seen foreign nationals use a loophole to get around this. Yesterday, I introduced legislation to close that loophole. When our committee heard from all 6 commissioners on the Federal Election Commissioner last year, Democrats and Republicans alike, every commissioner agreed that this loophole should be closed. And I'm hopeful that we can all agree that only American citizens should be contributing and voting in our elections. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today to discuss these important topics. And with that, I yield to the ranking member for 5 minutes for his opening remarks.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Stile, and thank you to each of our witnesses for being here this morning. Donald Trump's unprecedented attempt to stop the peaceful transfer of power is an appalling stain on American history. But it appears the lessons Republicans learned from the fiasco that the former president caused in 2020 was not don't steal an election, it was just start earlier. For all else being said here today, here's the one takeaway that you should remember, that we should be all very clear-eyed about. MAGA extremists are laying the groundwork to overturn the 2024 election, to betray once again the will of the American people. Today's hearing is not actually about non-citizens illegally voting in federal elections. Even the conservative Cato Institute acknowledges this isn't a problem. And what does Speaker Johnson have to say on the subject? Just last week, he declared that he knows intuitively that a lot of non-citizens are voting in federal elections, but it's not been something that is easily provable. Not provable because there's no proof. The Washington Post has it right. Republicans have increasingly acknowledged that their claims are all about the vibes. Republicans aren't governing based on facts. Frankly, they're not governing at all, and it's an embarrassment. This hearing is about preemptively covering Donald Trump's lies. The hearing isn't about law and order. It's about laying the foundation for the next big lie. It's about saying that illegal voting is the cause of an election defeat. And we know this is untrue because we know the law is already clear. And I'll read from 18 U.S. Code 611. Quote, "It shall be unlawful for any alien to vote in any election held solely or in part for the purpose of electing a candidate for the office of President, Vice President, Presidential Elector, Member of the Senate, Member of the House of Representatives," end quote, or other federal offices. I'll say it again. It is unlawful for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. A violation of this law is punishable by up to a year in prison, followed by deportation. Additionally, 52 U.S. Code 20511 makes, quote, "The procurement or submission of voter registration applications that are known by the person to be materially false, fictitious, or fraudulent," end quote, a felony, which, by the way, would result in a 5-year prison term and subsequent deportation. These laws are already on the books, and these laws work. That's why Speaker Johnson had to publicly admit he has no proof of fraud. Republicans know they work. My majority colleagues know, in their heart of hearts, the American elections are secure, fair, and free. They know this truth. Look at the parade of former Trump administration officials who, when put under oath, when facing penalty of perjury by Congress or other law enforcement officials, confirmed that their claims about fraud in the 2020 election were false, confirmed that President Trump lied to, and by the way, continues to lie every day to the American people. This is the public record. MAGA Republicans are howling about this non-issue, not because they believe American elections are insecure, but because they're desperate to destroy American confidence in elections. They want Americans to be afraid. They want Americans to believe Donald Trump's inevitable excuses, his torrent of lies about fraud when he, once again, leads the Republican Party down a path of insurrection. It is unconscionable that the same cast of characters that tried to steal an election 4 years ago are preparing to do it again and are using this committee, using this hearing to begin that process. The coup starts here. This is where it begins. When the history of Donald Trump's attempt to steal the 2024 election is written, and I assure you, history will look closely at each of us. The Speaker's trip to Mar-a-Lago last month will stand out. The Speaker's press conference on the Capitol steps last week will stand out. this hearing today will stand out. It is profoundly disappointing that my Republican colleagues are comfortable with that. I certainly am not. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other members' opening statements will be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Today we have a one-witness panel. We welcome Secretary Cord Byrd, Mr. Hans von Spakovsky, Mr. Christian Adams, Ms. Caitlin Sutherland, and Mr. Michael Waldman. Our first witness, Secretary Cord Byrd, serves as Florida's 37th Secretary of State. Prior to serving as Secretary, Mr. Byrd served in the Florida State Legislature, serving on the Public Integrity and Elections Committee, serving 2 years as Vice Chairman. Our next witness, Hans von Spakovsky, is a Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. As a manager of the think tank's Election Law Reform Initiative, Mr. von Spakovsky studies campaign finance restriction, voter fraud, voter ID, enforcement of voting rights laws, administration of elections, and voting equipment standards. Our next witness, J. Christian Adams, the President and General Counsel of the Public Interest Legal Foundation, a public interest law firm. His firm is responsible for ensuring states have clean voter rolls and holding them accountable under the National Voter Registration Act. Our next witness, Caitlin Sutherland, is the Executive Director for Americans for Public Trust. Americans for Public Trust has been at the forefront of reporting on foreign influence in U.S. elections. Our last witness, Mr. Michael Waldman, is President and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law. We appreciate you being with us today and look forward to each of your testimony. Pursuant to paragraph B of Committee Rule 6, the witnesses will please stand and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. We appreciate you all being with us today and look forward to your testimony. A reminder that we've read your written statements and they'll appear in full in the committee record. Under Committee Rule 9, you're to limit your presentation to 5 minutes. I'll now recognize Secretary Cord Byrd for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morelli, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. To begin, the United States Constitution provides that state legislatures prescribe the time, place, and manner of holding federal elections. Florida law states that, quote, a person may become a registered voter only if that person is a citizen of the United States. In 2020, Floridians amended the state constitution to make clear that, quote, only a citizen of the United States shall be eligible to vote. Florida has approximately 13.5 million active registered voters, and that number changes every minute of every day. A person turns 18, a person passes away, or a person becomes a U.S. citizen and registers to vote for the first time. According to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, 94,100 Floridians became naturalized U.S. citizens in 2023. The federal government has plenary authority over who becomes a naturalized citizen. The challenge states face is that there is not a federal legal status database that is current and reliable. The National Voter Registration Act, NVRA, of 1993, commonly known as the Motor Voter Law, introduced national procedures for voter registration. It mandates that any person who applies for a driver's license may, if eligible, submit a voter registration application for federal elections. When potential voters fill out a voter registration form, they must swear or affirm that they are a U.S. citizen. In Florida, it is a third-degree felony to falsely claim U.S. citizenship when registering to vote. Remarkably, however, federal courts have interpreted the NVRA to prohibit states from requiring proof of citizenship at the time a person registers. In effect, federal law forces the states to use the honor system. This is unacceptable. Because states are prevented from verifying citizenship on the front end, they must do so on the back end. Clean voter rolls become even more necessary for ensuring clean elections. Florida has robust voter roll maintenance procedures to identify registered voters who are not U.S. citizens. The names of potential non-citizens who attempt to obtain or renew a driver's license are reported to the Florida Department of State, which then conducts a manual, case-by-case investigation to determine whether the person is registered to vote and to confirm whether the person is in fact a U.S. citizen. Once the investigation is complete, and if the department determines that the person is registered but is not a citizen, the person cannot be removed from the voter roll without due process as provided by Florida law. Florida cannot verify the citizenship status of persons in the United States without the assistance and cooperation of the federal government. Indeed, the federal government is the only source of accurate, up-to-date information on the citizenship status of such persons. In 2012, after filing a lawsuit against the United States Department of Homeland Security, Florida became one of the first states to receive access to DHS's systematic alien verification from entitlement program, otherwise known as the SAVE database, for purpose of voter registration. Florida relies on this database to verify a person's citizenship status. But to be frank, the SAVE database is woefully inadequate. It is neither time nor cost efficient, and it requires an alien registration number, which states occasionally do not possess, to access the information. Perhaps most importantly, the database often lacks the most current information, which requires further time-consuming investigation. Indeed, because of the lack of timely information, states are sometimes unable to verify a person's citizenship status. That too is unacceptable. The federal government has a legal obligation to provide up-to-date citizenship information to the states. I urge Congress to address these deficiencies, which unfortunately can leave a gap in the state's ability to maintain clean voter rolls. At the very least, the federal government should provide immediate notification when a resident of the state is naturalized. DHS should also provide local election officials access to the SAVE database. Despite conducting a fair, honest, and efficient election in 2020, Florida did not rest on its laurels. In 3 successive legislative sessions, the Florida legislature passed substantial election integrity legislation. In 2022, for example, Governor Ron DeSantis signed a law creating the Office of Election Crimes and Security. This office conducts preliminary investigations into allegations of elections law violations or other election irregularities. OECS has referred non-citizen voting cases to law enforcement for further investigation. In 2004, the Baker-Carter report prepared by former President James Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker stated that, quote, fraud in any degree and in any circumstance is subversive to the electoral process, and that, quote, the best way to maintain ballot integrity is to investigate all credible allegations of election fraud and otherwise prevent fraud before it can affect an election. Voter fraud includes voting by non-citizens in federal elections. Every illegitimate vote of a non-citizen negates the legitimate vote of a citizen. In 2000, only 537 votes in Florida determined the outcome of the presidential race. Floridians have changed our state's constitution. We have strengthened our laws. We have engaged in litigation, and we have an office dedicated to investigating election crimes. The only impediment to doing more is the federal government. That's why states need action from our congressional leaders so we can fulfill our constitutional duties under the law.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you very much. Our next witness, Hans von Spakovsky, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Protecting the ability of American citizens to participate in our democratic process is one of the most important duties of Congress. That requires ensuring that aliens, both those here legally and illegally, are not unlawfully registering and voting, spending money to support or oppose candidates in state referenda, or distorting and diluting representation of citizens by being included in apportionment and redistricting. We know that aliens are registering and actually voting, although we don't know the extent of the problem, since the vast majority of states are not verifying citizenship. But the indicators that it's occurring are there, and it's important to understand that every vote by an alien voids the vote of a citizen. To verify the accuracy of voter registration data, state election officials should be given complete and easy access to the SAVE system that Secretary Byrd mentioned, but also to the E-Verify system. Federal courts obtain their lists of potential jurors from state election officials. When someone is not a U.S. citizen, they are excused from jury duty, yet the federal courts are not forwarding that information back to secretaries of state so they can take appropriate action. Congress needs to amend the NVRA to clarify that the NVRA does not prohibit states from requiring applicants to provide proof they are U.S. citizens. Congress also, because of its constitutional authority over aliens, could make that a requirement for federal elections. The federal government requires individuals to provide such proof in order to be employed. And the right to work and earn a living is just as important as the right to vote. Barring states from requiring proof of citizenship makes no sense, particularly when the federal government requires that in order to be employed. The federal application for naturalization form asks whether an alien has, quote, ever registered to vote or voted in any federal, state, or local election in the United States. When an alien answers yes, DHS just sits on that information. Federal law needs to be changed to require DHS, when they get a yes answer, to forward that information to the state election official where that alien registered or voted, to the state attorney general, and to the U.S. Department of Justice so that state election officials can take that individual off the rolls and state and federal prosecutors can investigate and prosecute. Federal campaign finance law prohibits federal governments and aliens from participating in elections for candidates for office. But the definition of elections in the Federal Election Campaign Act does not include ballot referenda, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, and according to the FEC, it also does not include recall elections. That is a change that needs to be made in the law to keep foreign influence out of our elections. Reapportionment after the 2020 census gave additional seats to some states and reduced the number of seats held by 7. 6 states got more seats, 7 states had their representatives reduced. But that reapportionment was based on the total population of the U.S., which includes all aliens, whether they're here legally or illegally, even though they are not allowed to participate in our democratic political process. In addition to distorting representation in the House, it distorts our presidential election because, of course, reapportionment determines how many electoral votes someone has. How bad is the distortion? A 2015 report by the Congressional Research Service estimated that apportionment based on citizen population would give additional seats to 7 states and reduce the number of seats in 4 states. Given the unprecedented influx of aliens into this country in the last number of years, that distortion is obviously much worse today. We should provide both access and security in the election process for all eligible U.S. citizens. But allowing aliens to participate in the election process unfairly dilutes the votes of all citizens, regardless of their race or which political party they affiliate with. Congress and the states need to take steps to stop this from happening. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Mr. Christian Adams is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morelli, members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to testify. In this polarized atmosphere, it would be wonderful if we could agree on a few basic facts. Non-citizens are, in fact, getting onto American voter rolls, and some of them are voting. The data show that most often non-citizens are getting on the rolls through the motor voter process or third-party registration drives. Ignoring this problem ignores the harmful impacts to both our elections, but also to the aliens who are caught in the system breakdown. Because they have registered to vote, often at the behest of third parties or bureaucrats, these well-meaning green card holders face deportation. When a foreigner registers to vote in the motor voter system, as undeniably happened by the thousands in Pennsylvania, every American should be concerned. Once upon a time, fixing this problem would have been a bipartisan priority. We've identified 4 core elements that lead to foreigners registering and voting. Number 1, a faulty motor voter system facilitates alien registration and then voting. We discovered this most dramatically in Pennsylvania in 2017, where every PennDOT customer was offered voter registration for an estimated 2 decades, regardless of citizenship. Even worse, foreign language customers were screened in different written languages than the ones they speak, that increased the number of foreign voter registrations. Element 2, when states do not or are prevented from investigating prior claims of non-citizenship, foreign nationals fill the rolls. In previous years, states like Florida and Texas have been disrupted by the courts from trying to study indications of foreign citizenship among existing registrants. Element 3, when election officials do not carefully review forms, foreigners get registered. The federal form that Congress approved 30 years ago requires an attestation of U.S. citizenship via a checkbox. After 30 years of motor voter, we can conclusively say the checkbox honor system has failed. Unfortunately, my organization has found in California, Florida, Texas, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and other states where applicants actually admitted on the registration form they weren't U.S. citizens and still got registered to vote. We call these checkbox no's. Litigation that the Public Interest Legal Foundation has brought has revealed disturbing numbers of checkbox no's. Registrations across the country where they tell the election official they're not a citizen and they still get registered to vote. Election officials are dropping the ball. Finally, element 4, a lack of transparency. Secrecy preserves bad practices and fosters conspiratorial concerns. When people don't know the truth, they think things up that aren't true. And that's why states have to comply with Section 8 of NVRA and disclose public records. In 2024, it is no longer an open question whether foreign nationals are registering and voting. Anyone who would try to argue otherwise has not read the data. We have documented the problems. We've documented the Middle Eastern immigrant whose green card was revoked in Pennsylvania after PennDOT offered him registration in an unfamiliar language. He lost 7 years of his life trying to clear his name until Pennsylvania admitted to a mass glitch in the motor voter system. We've documented the Sudanese refugee in Pittsburgh who was given an English voter registration form at a time when he needed an interpreter. We found records of a San Francisco college student whose coursework was disrupted because he mistook a federal voter drive for a campus election. This is just a tiny sample of the stacks of documents that we have available of victims, aliens who are in the green card process, who've been sucked into the motor voter system, registered to vote, and jeopardize their legal status in the United States. People are registering through a broken motor voter system. They're victims to this broken system, and Congress can fix it through a few basic, simple fixes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Ms. Caitlin Sutherland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morelli, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation and opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Caitlin Sutherland, and I'm the Executive Director of Americans for Public Trust, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to restoring trust in government by holding politicians and political groups accountable. Since our founding in 2020, APT has devoted extensive resources to uncovering, mapping, and publicizing outside money and influence in politics and policy. Americans should have every confidence that their elections are free from foreign interference and influence. But unfortunately, a significant source of foreign cash is flowing into politics from a Swiss billionaire named Hans-Jörg Wyss. Multiple press outlets have confirmed Mr. Wyss is a foreign national. But don't just take their word for it. Listen to what Mr. Wyss has said about the matter. In 2011, Mr. Wyss told a Swiss newspaper that he, quote, never felt the need to become an American, end quote. He claimed he found the process too, quote, complicated, end quote, and instead preferred to call himself, quote, a spiritual dual citizen, end quote. Despite Mr. Wyss's disinterest in becoming an American citizen, he made it a personal goal to influence American politics. According to a biography written by his own sister, Mr. Wyss's goal is to, quote, reinterpret the American Constitution in the light of progressive politics, end quote. So how is Mr. Wyss, who is not a US citizen and therefore prohibited from directly and indirectly influencing our elections, doing just that? Well, first in the 90s and early aughts, he, seemingly illegally, gave more than $100,000 directly to candidates and committees. But Mr. Wyss's direct giving pales into comparison to his current and preferred method of influencing our politics, his nonprofits. Mr. Wyss uses his two nonprofits, the Wyss Foundation, a 501c3, and the Burger Action Fund, formerly called the Wyss Action Fund, a 501c4, to fund liberal groups across the nation. He has used these two nonprofits to pump almost $500 million into the US political system. In his biography, Mr. Wyss's sister explicitly detailed his ability to, quote, exert an influence on American domestic politics through his foundations, end quote. If this sounds like a staggering amount of money from a reclusive foreign billionaire and organizations that are far from being household names, that's because it's all by design. Again, while speaking to foreign media, Mr. Wyss admitted that he was fighting laws in Arizona that, quote, give police too many rights, end quote, working to nominate progressive federal judges and funding abortion clinics. But the catch? He also bragged that his, quote, name never appears, end quote, linked to his efforts. In fact, the Associated Press described Burger Action Fund as, quote, a nondescript name for a group with a rather specific purpose, steering the wealth of Hans-Jörg Wyss, a Swiss billionaire, into the world of American politics and policy. So how exactly, in his own words, does he exert an influence? According to the New York Times, Mr. Wyss's, quote, political activism is channeled through a daisy chain of opaque organizations that mask the ultimate recipients of his money. The most opaque of those organizations is a little-known group called the 1630 Fund, which, according to Bloomberg, serves as, quote, a clearinghouse for the left, end quote, and has also received $243 million from Mr. Wyss. 1630 Fund bankrolls efforts to elevate President Biden's agenda, funds Supreme Court nomination fights, invests in massive voter turnout operations, engages in issue advocacy campaigns against vulnerable Republican senators and representatives, and has funneled nearly $100 million and counting into state ballot issues across 25 states. That's right, the same group that has received around $250 million from a foreign national turns around and spends it on GOTV, voter registration, super PACs, and ballot issues. These foreign influence loopholes must be closed. Foreign nationals are already barred from donating to candidates directly, so why should all these vehicles that influence our elections be any different? American elections should be for American citizens. Stopping foreign nationals, whether they be a reclusive Swiss billionaire or a communist dictator, from funding U.S. policy fights is a simple step to take. In his 1796 farewell address, George Washington cautioned that, quote, foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government, end quote. Over 200 years later, that sentiment remains true. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Michael Waldman is recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Morelli, members of the committee, Americans are concerned about the health of our democracy, and rightly so. Ever since our nation was founded in the Declaration of Independence, on the idea that government is legitimate only when it rests on the consent of the governed, we have struggled over decades and centuries to live up to that ideal, to make sure that our ability to have self-government extends to all eligible Americans. All of us, whatever our views, should care and fight for elections that are free and fair and secure. So in the sweep of American history, the rise of the election denier movement is extremely disturbing. Never before has there been an organized political force determined and devoted to undermining public trust in our system and in our elections in this manner. Now, in 2020, we heard wild stories of voting machines flipping votes, of boxes of ballots, of ballot paper that supposedly had bamboo fibers in it to prove it came from China. This year, we're hearing the beginning of wild stories about widespread, huge numbers of non-citizens voting in federal elections. So let's be clear, this is an urban myth. It is a conspiracy theory. It is not true. Why is it happening now? It's being pushed preemptively, I believe, to set the stage for undermining the legitimacy of the 2024 election. This year, the big lie is being pre-deployed. And it is the basis for the SAVE Act and what we believe is an unnecessary and misguided piece of legislation. As we have heard, it is illegal today for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. Very illegal. States have a multiplicity of procedures in place to detect and prevent it. And as a result, non-citizen voting in federal elections is vanishingly rare. Now, this legislation would essentially require citizens, eligible voters, to produce a birth certificate or a passport or naturalization papers in some instances to vote. These are documents that many millions of Americans do not have. Eligible voters, citizens do not have. Now, Speaker Mike Johnson, as we've heard, said recently on the Capitol steps that we all know that intuitively this all must be happening. As he said, quote, but it has not been something that is easily provable. In fact, it is easily disprovable. Any individual who illegally registers or votes in a federal election leaves a paper trail. They are handing the evidence of their crime over to the government. These records are publicly available to all for scrutiny, and as I say, governments have ample opportunity to find, detect, and prevent this kind of action. There are real problems in our electoral system, challenges to our elections, disinformation and deepfakes driven by AI, racially motivated voter suppression, a broken campaign finance system, gerrymandering by both political parties. Congress should act to address these and other real challenges. So we urge the Congress to enact the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Together, they would modernize our elections, set national standards, address gerrymandering and dark money and funds from outside the country, and restore the full strength of the nation's most effective civil rights law. And at the very least, we urge Congress to act on a bipartisan basis, as it has before, to provide funds for election officials to do the very work of securing election integrity and securing accurate lists, voter rolls, and running these elections in upcoming appropriations, as has been the case in previous years. We can do this. We can bolster election integrity while ensuring free and fair elections. We can do this if we rely on facts, not fear, facts, not, quote, intuition. Congress has done this before, it should do it again, and we urge you to reject measures that would undermine faith in our system and disenfranchise many eligible voters, and instead come together for reforms that would improve our system and continue our march toward that system envisioned by the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I'll begin our questions today, followed by the ranking member. We'll then alternate between parties. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of asking our witnesses questions. Mr. Christian Adams, I want to start with you. Federal law makes it a felony for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. Is that correct?
It is.
And federal law also makes it a felony to submit a voter form with false info, like citizenship, correct?
Correct.
But under the NVRA, National Voter Registration Act, states are required to provide voter registration materials at various state offices, including those providing public assistance, right?
Yes, it has one, but it's limited the burden on the states. But
Okay, so how does the NVRA deal with the situation when non-citizens receive public benefits like driver's licenses? Do they get voter registration materials?
well, some states have started to cram in voter registration materials with those public benefit applications, which are going to citizens and non-citizens alike.
Okay, so with that background, then the situation in Pennsylvania, what did your organization learn about the voter rolls when you brought the lawsuit in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, this is a disaster, what happened in Pennsylvania, that has not gotten enough attention. Steve Dinan at the Washington Times has written about it. Pennsylvania was registering non-citizens for 20 years, and they admit it. This is not subject to debate. And the question is, was it 10,000 or 100,000?
And so that needs to be fixed immediately in Pennsylvania, correct?
Well, we're suing to see what they did to fix it, and we're in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. We've already won summary judgment to get the records of the fix, but Pennsylvania's playing keep away.
Thank you for that. Let me shift to you, Mr. Hans von Spakovsky, if I can. Ohio recently announced that they did a review and found 100 non-citizens on their voter rolls. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And so then, sticking with the topic of non-citizen voting, isn't it true that this November, non-citizens that reside in D.C. for simply 30 days can vote in D.C. municipal elections?
That's correct.
And D.C. also mails every registered voter a ballot, correct?
Correct.
And so you're telling me that in Washington, D.C., if there is even a small clerical mistake, non-citizens could be mailed a ballot with federal races on them?
That's correct.
But we've heard and we know it's a felony for non-citizens to vote in federal races, but the D.C. Board of Elections held a call a few weeks ago encouraging non-citizens to vote in the municipal elections and told the public it was on the non-citizen to understand they can't vote in the federal election, correct?
That's correct.
And so then I want to go back because we heard from one of our other witnesses that non-citizen voting is a myth, that there's no evidence of this. But was there a case where there was a close election in the House of Representatives and Congress went back and studied whether or not non-citizens actually partook in that election or not?
There was, and in fact, I brought the report. This is the House Oversight Committee report from 1998, and it was the investigation of the Race between Bob Dorn and Loretta Sanchez. Margin of victory, 979 votes. Because the INS refused to give the committee records, they had to subpoena them. And when they compared the INS records to the Orange County Register, they found clear and convincing evidence that 624 aliens had registered and voted. They found circumstantial evidence of 196 aliens who'd registered and voted. That's 820.
What did they have to do to be able to cross-check that?
They had to take the INS records and check it against the voter registration records.
Is this done in every election?
No, it's not.
Well, we were
done-
told there was
it's
a
not done
paper
at all.
trail. We were told there by another witness that there was a paper trail. You're telling me that this paper trail only came because Congress subpoenaed the records in this case.
That's exactly right, and that's why, as Secretary Byrd said, Secretary of State need to be given access to DHS records.
So Secretary Byrd, if you were concerned, you run a solid elections in the state of Florida, but if you were concerned that this was taking place, would you have the access that Congress had in the review of the 1998 election?
We do not have that access in a timely and efficient manner.
Would you like the access to that?
Absolutely.
It would make total sense to be able, we were told that there's a paper trail to allow you to go into review whether or not this is taking place, because as Hans von Spakovsky just said, that in the case where it was reviewed, over 600 individuals were found to be non-citizens who voted in that election. Is that correct? I'll come back to you, Hans von Spakovsky, on that.
It is, and it's against the law. I'm not aware that the U.S. Department of Justice investigated or prosecuted a single one of those aliens who voted. And I have personal experience with this also. I was on the Fairfax County Board of Elections, and in 2011, I asked the General Registrar, do you all check the DMV records to see whether individuals who show up to get a driver's license, here legally, but they're aliens, do you check to see whether they've registered to vote? And he said, well, no, we don't do that. I said, you need to do that. So they checked. They found 278 individuals. This is just one county in Virginia, who were aliens. They investigated. They confirmed they were aliens. 117 of them had voted in prior elections. We took the 278 off the rolls, forwarded it to both the local Commonwealth attorney, because it's against the law in Virginia. He did nothing about it.
So the way that you're describing this sounds a lot like, to me, that somebody's saying that there's nobody speeding on the interstate. And I would say, well, how do you know that? And it's, well, it's very clear. The speed limit's 70 miles per hour. So we know no one is going over 70 miles an hour, and the evidence of that is there's no speeding tickets that have ever been issued.
No,
Where if you actually went and reviewed this, as was done in this case, what we found was this is an actual and substantive problem, exacerbated by the fact that places like Washington, D.C. are allowing non-citizens to vote in municipal elections, don't have proper controls to prevent them from voting in federal elections. And then as we look, a staffer on my committee walked by this ballot box in Washington, D.C., unlocked, unsecured. Does this increase confidence in elections, in your opinion, Mr. von Spakovsky?
No, it implements a huge risk that something could happen to those ballots. It could be stuffed with ballots. Ballots could be stolen. I mean,
So if Washington, D.C. Board of Elections, if this is how they're operating their ballot box collection, less than 1 mile from where we sit right here, it gives me great pause that there's not any clerical errors occurring as to when they have non-citizens on the voter rolls in Washington, D.C. being in a position to vote for federal elections. That should cause grave concern, which is why non-citizens shouldn't be voting in our elections, period. And it shows from the evidence here is exactly why we should actually be reviewing and enforcing the law as it relates to non-citizens voting in our federal elections. Let me shift gears before I'm done quickly to you, Ms. Sutherland, on a slightly different topic about foreign funds in U.S. elections. So today, under current law, can foreign nationals pay for activities like voter registration, ballot harvesting, and get-out-the-vote activities?
Yes.
That's really concerning. We already saw the massive problems associated with Zuckerbucks in the 2020 election. We've held hearings on it here and flushed out those concerns. Congress needs to close that loophole. Now, doesn't federal law generally prohibit foreign nationals from directly or indirectly spending money in U.S. elections?
That's correct.
But as your organization's documented, foreign nationals are using nonprofits as a pass-through to give to often Democratic super PACs. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you explain that problem briefly?
Absolutely. So foreign nationals are prohibited from contributing to super PACs directly, but there's nothing prohibiting a foreign national from contributing to a 501c4 that then turns around and gives to a super PAC. In fact, in 2020, we saw that the 1630 fund that received tens of millions of dollars from a foreign national turned around and contributed $60 million to pro-Biden super PACs.
Exactly the problem. When we had the FEC commissioners in here, Democrats and Republicans alike all agreed that we should close that loophole. I've introduced legislation to do just that, Preventing Foreign Interference in Americans Elections Act. I would love to see a full vote in favor by all 12 members of this committee. I think it's essential, as we're looking at foreign interference in our elections, that we come together to close that loophole that you just identified, that every FEC commissioner that testified before us said should also be closed. This should be a no-brainer, and I hope to have that done before this November's election. I thank all of you for being here today. I yield back, and I'll now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this committee has already acted on that bill, I thought, unanimously. I may be mistaken, but be happy to work with you, and I think that's an important thing that we should work on. I do ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record an article published this morning by Reuters entitled "Trump Allies Laying the Groundwork to Contest Potential Election Loss," which reports that Trump and his allies are planting seeds of doubt about the election, including the introduction of this bill. And I will ask for
Without
unanimous
objection.
consent to
Without
include
objection.
that in the record. I said in my opening statement, and I'll make clear again, everyone watching should be clear, this hearing is not a serious effort to stop non-citizens from voting, which does not happen and is already illegal, as I think everyone has testified. And we know it again because of what the speaker said. He admitted they have no evidence. So even what's being talked about here, he didn't suggest that as evidence during his press conference. He said we actually intuitively know it. I think others would agree, there's an effort to help the former president capture the presidency, and we should be clear about what a Trump presidency would bring to this country. To do so, we need to look no further than Project 2025, which is an extremist 920-page manifesto embraced by the Trump campaign to reshape the federal government into an arch-conservative Christian nationalist autocracy. Project 2025, organized by the Heritage Foundation, calls on a second Trump administration to massively expand the power of the presidency and the power of the government over Americans' daily lives. And it outlines how a future Trump Department of Justice will prevent women nationwide from accessing health care, including access to abortion. In fact, Donald Ayer, a Republican, a Deputy Attorney General of the United States under George H.W. Bush, said that Project 2025 is full of, quote, ideas that are designed to let Donald Trump function as a dictator. He really wants to destroy any notion of a rule of law in this country and is now preparing to do a bunch of things totally contrary to the basic values we have always lived by. If Trump were to be elected and implement some of the ideas he is apparently considering, no one in this country would be safe. That's a Republican, former Deputy Attorney General of the United States. So how does this all tie in today's hearing? Well, the majority has called one of the leading architects of Project 2025 to testify on behalf of their bill. So I really have to give you credit for saying the quiet part out loud. My majority colleagues aren't even trying to hide what they intend to do. They invited the architects of the Day One dictator plan to this hearing, and I think it shows how extreme and undemocratic the entire exercise is. And the American public deserve a full transparency about what the Trump campaign is planning, what the majority witness in his organization is planning. And I would like to, with unanimous consent, introduce for the record, Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise Project 2025 into the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Waldman, let me ask you, are you familiar with Project 2025?
I am.
If this hearing is meant to help Donald Trump contest the outcome of the 2024 election, and it most certainly is, then plans like this Project 2025 and conservative activists like those called by the majority are preparing to assist Donald Trump's administration implement catastrophic policies that Americans fundamentally oppose. By your estimation, how would Project 2025 damage American democracy and the rule of law?
Well, Project 2025 lays out in audacious detail a blueprint for an expansion of presidential power unlike any we've seen in our history. It's not just a policy agenda for conservative policies on taxes or the environment. It would fundamentally reshape checks and balances in the constitutional system. It would give a blueprint for the president taking control of the Justice Department and the FBI, for the president taking control of independent agencies. It would, in couple with other agendas, such as Schedule F, which would involve the purging of the federal workforce of many civil servants to be replaced by political loyalists, or the use of the Insurrection Act as a basis either for crackdown on opposition or as a basis for very aggressive seizing of non-citizens, as articulated by former President Trump. A whole host of things, all taken together, would change the nature of American government to something very different from what the founders intended or what any of us would be comfortable with.
You know, the unsubstantiated fear-mongering about insecure elections, voter fraud that we heard in the days, weeks, and months leading up to the January 6th deadly attacks on the Capitol. You know, we've heard this before, and I wonder, again, Mr. Waldman, if you want to comment, do you see any parallels between this effort now to suggest that there's rampant fraud in federal elections as a pretext for 2024?
It is not a mistake that it's happening now. It is, as I said, the big lie is being pre-deployed. And in 2020, the election deniers were improvisational and somewhat slapdash. Now it is very well organized, and it is very well funded, and it is thought out well in advance to try to set the stage for challenging the legitimacy of elections. As we know, Donald Trump in 2016 said that he had really won the popular vote. If you could deduct the millions of non-citizens who voted, he said. These were evidently invisible people because nobody ever saw them and there was never any proof. And that was an election he won. He did the same thing with other charges in 2020. And it's important to note, too, that this myth of widespread tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of non-citizen voters was deployed in 2020 as well. Rudy Giuliani lost his law license in part because of his lies about non-citizen voting in Arizona. Lies, I should note, that were repeated by President Trump on the ellipse as he sent the crowd up to the Capitol. So this was not the central argument then, but it is now.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the extra time, Mr. Chair. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Bice is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to address a comment that was made prior in opening statements to Mr. Waldman. You mentioned that you felt like there were not massive numbers of illegals voting, and this shouldn't be a focus. But I think with more than 7 million illegals crossing into the United States in the last 3 or plus years, it is our duty that we ensure that we are protecting the integrity of the election system. And so that's why we're here today, is to ensure that that doesn't happen. Yes, we have identified, Mr. Adams has identified areas where this is occurring, but to suggest that we shouldn't be focused on this because it's not happening now, I think is misguided. Mr. von Spakovsky, in jurisdictions that allow non-citizens like Washington, D.C., to vote, will non-citizens be on the same voter registration lists as citizens?
As far as I know, they will be. And if I just quickly mention, the only requirement is to be arrested for 30 days. That means the ambassador from Russia, the tyrannical regime trying to obliterate Ukraine, could easily register and vote in that.
Should federal law require these jurisdictions to have 2 separate lists and 2 separate ballots to ensure that this type of situation does not happen?
Yes, they should. Otherwise, aliens may be voting even when they shouldn't be in federal elections.
And can you talk a little bit about the proposal that you've been championing, which requires federal district courts to transmit the names of dismissed non-citizen jurors to the state's chief election officials?
Sure. In 2005, I think it is, GAO actually did a study on this. They were looking at information that might be helpful to state election officials. They surveyed a number of federal district courts, and one federal district court said, well, I think it was a 2-year period, about 3% of the individuals been called for jury duty had been excused because they were not U.S. citizens. And remember, you have to swear under oath when you're answering questions like that. Obviously, that information should have been sent back to state election officials because those district courts also all confirmed where were they getting their list of potential voters in places like Atlanta and Arizona from the state election officials. So clearly, these were all individuals, aliens, who were registered to vote, excused from federal jury duty, yet the information wasn't getting back to election officials.
I want to pivot back just briefly with Ms. Sutherland's discussion on foreign influence in our elections through these C4 organizations. And I want to enter into the record, ask unanimous consent to enter a report from the People United for Privacy on the impacts of foreign donor reporting schemes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Adams, I want to move over to you. The National Voter Registration Act exempted two states from requirements for registration. Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Sure. I've had the pleasure, I guess, of reading the congressional record from '93, and one of the issues was an exemption. And there were 7 states at the time. Maine has since been unexempted, but the 7 states, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Idaho, Wyoming, and North Dakota, were exempted from the NVRA originally because they had same-day registration. They had same-day registration. North Dakota doesn't even have voter registration, so they were exempted. We actually brought a lawsuit in Minnesota and Wisconsin the last week to question that as an unequal sovereignty issue, that we're trying to get public records, because you can't get public records in Wisconsin, especially from WEC, and not easily at least. And so we're trying to get public records in Wisconsin and challenging that exemption.
If Congress were to amend the Voter Registration Act, as some are thinking about doing, how would it work in these states that are exempt?
Right. I think Congress should strongly consider ending the exemption, because these states are already doing the motor voter registration generally, right? They're complying with what the Democrats wanted in '93, but they're not complying with the Dole Compromise of '93, which was to make them subject to public inspection and to have clean voter rolls. So those 6 states are exempted from the clean voter roll obligation that I think Congress should seriously take a look at.
I think the big issue that I have is, as we're looking at this holistically, is that the voter rolls are not being cleaned up, which is causing some of the issues that we're seeing, and certainly we need to be addressing that. With that, Mr. Chairman, my time is about up. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Sewell is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here. As the author of the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and as the ranking member of the Election Subcommittee, there's nothing more important to me than making sure that every eligible American has a right to vote and equal access to the ballot box. Having said that, it's quite disturbing to me to listen to some of the allegations that's going on, but more importantly, the concerted, intentional efforts, as you said, Mr. Waldman, to actually well-fund efforts to subvert the will of the people for the 2024 election. I know that in Alabama, where I'm from, there is this belief that there's widespread fraud. And I know that the Brennan Center has done multiple studies about the fact that that is rare. And you, in fact, said that, that the incidence of non-Americans voting, I don't like to say illegal aliens, just non-Americans voting is minuscule and rare. Yet other witnesses have suggested that it happens in Virginia and it happens in Florida. And I wanted to know what your rebuttal is to that.
Over the decades, there have been billions of votes cast by Americans, and overwhelmingly, our system is secure. As the Department of Homeland Security, Donald Trump's own Department of Homeland Security said in 2020, it was the most secure election in American history. And there is a multiplicity of systems in place that have been developed over the years to ensure that non-citizens are not voting in federal elections, to ensure that only eligible citizens are. And unfortunately, we continue to see over and over again proposals that would make it harder for eligible citizens to vote. I'll note that
Especially after the Shelby versus Holder decision, when we saw a flood of states making it harder for people to vote, Americans to vote.
and we have now new evidence compiled by political scientists at the Brennan Center from a data set of 1 billion voter records, nearly 1 billion voter records, that the states that used to be covered by the strong Voting Rights Act,
Like
before
Alabama?
Alabama and other states under before Shelby County in 2013, have seen a much wider growth in the gap between voter participation rates by white voters and non-white voters, which suggests the impact of that decision.
So let's talk about the SAVE Act that is currently being discussed. I personally think that it's trying to delegitimize votes by those who are of color, whether that's Black, Latino, Asian, Native American, let alone to allow them to cast a vote. Can you talk a little bit about the SAVE Act and why you think that this is so destructive?
Well, you're exactly right, that we all should be making sure that our voter rolls are secure and accurate, and that only
And to be
eligible
clear,
people can
all of
vote.
us wanted to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat, don't we all?
We all do. Among many other things, the ERIC system, where states compared voter rolls, was the most effective way to assure accurate rolls, and other conspiracy theories and other scare stories prompted states to pull out of that, actually setting back the cause of election security. When you look at the proposal for documentary proof of citizenship, which sounds like a kind of an anodyne idea. Again, what that means in practice is a certified birth certificate or a passport or maybe naturalization papers. And many millions of Americans just don't have that. We did a study in 2006 that at that point found it was 13 million Americans. And you think about not only that people don't have these things, most Americans, or at least about half Americans, do not have a passport. They're not summering in the south of France.
My state, along with a lot of other states, imposed photo ID laws, and they prescribed in their state laws which photos are acceptable and which are not. I found it to be appalling that my state refused to take a student's license but would accept a gun permit license. And yet we're choosing winners and losers. And at the end of the day, I have had lots of my constituents talk to me about, especially the elderly or the disabled, who don't drive anymore, who don't have valid IDs according to these papers, but yet they have a validly federal ID, which is called a Social Security card, that everybody has, that's an American. And I think that it's really appalling that we're spending our time talking about this effort when the reality is we need to fully fund federal elections. I think you touched upon that. We have the Federal Elections Commission, but we also have the Election Assistance Commission, and they're not funded. Actually, we zero out their budget. Can you talk a little bit about that in the time remaining?
Yes, over the years, Congress, on a bipartisan basis, has provided support, robust support for state election administration, which is so vital to our country. And it has not done so recently, and we think that the next
Mr. Chairman.
appropriations bill
Thank you, sir.
ought to include
He's
that.
but I wanted to also just ask for unanimous consent to add 4 things to the record. An article in The Hill by Ranking Member Morelli published today entitled "Republicans and Already Try to Undermine the 2024 Election," a letter from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and the Declaration for American Democracy Coalition opposing the SAVE Act, as well as an article from the Washington Post entitled "Mike Johnson's Telling Comments on GOP's Lack of Voter Fraud Evidence," and lastly, an article from the Vote Beat entitled "Documents Show Republican-Led States Struggling to Clean Voter Rolls After Leaving ERIC." Can I please?
Without
submit
objection. Mr. Loudermilk is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Election integrity ranks in the top 3 issues that are most important to Americans across the board. I mean, this is Republicans, Democrats, and independents. This isn't a partisan issue. This is an election integrity issue. When we allow someone who is not legally authorized to vote in this country to make decisions that are incredibly important to the safety, the security, and the economic viability of Americans, we undermine and undercut the value of each and every individual vote, whether Republican, Democrat, Independent, or whatever. So this is extremely important to both sides. This isn't a political issue, or it shouldn't be. This should be an issue that I would venture to say 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we would not be having this debate on a partisan basis. We would be looking for solutions to make sure every American, regardless of race, creed, religion, whatever, that their vote counts and is not discredited by someone who should not be voting. We have a couple of bills that are trying to address these, and Mr. von Spakovsky, I want to ask you about your thoughts regarding Representative Roy's recently introduced SAVE Act. I know he's trying to address this. We have the ACE Act that we've worked on for a long time in this committee. Regarding the SAVE Act, do you think it gives states the right tools to prevent non-citizens from registering to vote?
Yeah, of course they do, and the impediments that have been put in their way to prevent them from doing that need to be eliminated. By the way, can I just say very quickly, all these claims that, for example, states requiring proof of citizenship is somehow going to suppress the vote, keep people from voting, that's exactly the same kind of mythical claims have been made against voter ID for more than a decade, and yet the turnout numbers show, particularly in your state of Georgia, first time in a presidential election ID, 2008, the turnout numbers show it did not suppress votes. You've had record registration, record voting of all voters, including minority voters in your state.
And if I may add on to that, the voter ID requirement, my understanding, and you may confirm this, is that is a bipartisan issue. It ranks very highly among Democrat voters as well. Am I correct?
Yeah, the polling universally, and it doesn't matter whether you go to a Rasmussen poll, Washington Post poll, the polling shows that Americans simply don't believe this idea that somehow it's going to keep people from voting. Overwhelmingly, voters say that's a common sense requirement, and it doesn't matter which political party they're a member of or what their race or ethnicity is.
Voter rolls, I think, are the key to most of this. And I hear of quite often people telling me they've moved out of state. I hear from people that have moved from Georgia, from another state, and they're still getting ballots from their previous state. Does the SAVE Act go far enough with their mandatory list provisions, maintenance provisions?
Oh, I think it's a good start on helping to fix that problem. There are more things that states could be doing. As Secretary Byrd can tell you, Florida, for example, is now entering into agreements with other states to compare and share their voter registration data to, in fact, find people who are registered in more than one state, which that is a problem, and more states need to be encouraged to do that.
You touched on this a few minutes ago, and it's regarding databases.
Right.
Are there additional databases that states should have access to get the information they need to remove non-citizens from the rolls? I mean, you've already talked about jury duty, but what databases should they be able to access?
Well, we've mentioned the SAVE system. We've also mentioned E-Verify. But those who think that's enough, it isn't. And the reason for that is, look, DHS is going to have in its records aliens who are here legally, aliens who are here illegally who have been detained. But aliens who have gotten into the country, have never been detained, never been processed, are not going to be in it. And in fact, again, if you look at this report from 1998, the committee says, look, we found 820 aliens who were in the INS records who were registered to vote, but that's only documented aliens. They said that leaves open the question, well, how many aliens were registered who had never been processed or caught by the INS?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And let me just close with this. My time is up. That what we're trying to do here is to ensure that an election not only can't be stolen, but the accusation of that will never happen again. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Kilner is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chairman. My first question is for Mr. Waldman. Appreciate the concerns you raised in your testimony about the capacity of foreign adversaries to interfere in American elections. And one of the things that I've been looking at quite a bit is the fact that right now, if any of us run ads on TV or ads on the radio, there are certain disclosure requirements. You get to know who paid for that ad. There's a, in essence, the public file where people can see the information about that ad. That is not true for internet-based advertisement. And, why is that a problem? Well, one, we know that more and more political spending is migrating into that arena. And two, we know from declassified reports by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence that Russia, China, Iran, and others have sought to influence public perception of candidates through the internet. So we have a bipartisan, bicameral bill called the Honest Ads Act to try to close that gap, and it simply would provide the same accountability and transparency standards that exist for TV and radio and apply them to the internet. What do you think?
Well, thank you for your leadership in the introduction of the Honest Ads Act. We think it is very important. This year, we think that up to 30% of spending on political ads will be online. And the protections that were in place in an era of broadcast TV and antennas on the top of your set are not enough for the digital era, and especially the era we're moving into with all the risks of disinformation and deepfakes and everything else. So we think that the Honest Ads Act, which is bicameral and bipartisan, should be an urgent priority. I should note that important elements of it are also in the Freedom to Vote Act as part of that significant upgrade of the American electoral system.
Thanks. And I just had commend to any of my colleagues here, happy to share information with you about that bill, because I think it's, to me, that is a common sense, how do we keep foreign actors from trying to mess with our elections? I want to stick with you. I share some of the concerns you've raised about the impacts of the SAVED Act on eligible voters in the U.S. When I think about some of these issues regarding voter engagement and access to the ballot box, I think about my grandma. We called her Oma. She was a remarkable woman. She survived 2 world wars. She was liberated by Allied soldiers and came to this country from the Netherlands in 1948. She built a life here. She became an American citizen at the age of 87 because she wanted to vote. She lived till just south of 109 years old. And she was an incredibly proud voter. As a person who was born 10 years before women's suffrage in this country, she was an incredibly proud voter. And so I think about some of these bits of legislation sort of through her perspective, right? She became a citizen at 87. At her age, she didn't have a passport because from her perspective, she was too old to travel anywhere. She didn't have a driver's license. She had never driven. You can buy a photo ID in the state of Washington, but it costs now it costs $54. That's a poll tax, right? That's a poll tax, right? And so, when I think about some of these requirements, I think about it, does it pass the My Oma test? And, I also think about some of the tribes in my district. I represent a district with 12 tribes. Folks from tribal nations have every right to participate in our democracy and the voting process. However, tribal enrollment cards, which are used in Washington states as official identification, don't necessarily contain information about citizenship. And folks from tribal nations shouldn't also be forced to pay a poll tax to participate in democracy. So I'd love to get your thoughts and just have you share more about impacts of this SAVED Act when it comes to voters' access to what is their right.
Well, you're exactly right that there are so many voters who have been voting for decades, who are eligible voters, who would be adversely affected by a requirement that you show a passport or a certified birth certificate or naturalization papers to vote. These are people who have been living up to their responsibility to vote, like your grandmother, over so many years, who would suddenly find themselves unable to do so. And in the states where this was briefly in effect, we saw tens of thousands of eligible voters being unable to vote.
Eligible voters.
Yes, and you mentioned the tribal voters from the tribal nations are much less likely, for example, as I understand it, to have birth certificates of a kind that would be treated as acceptable here. I'm not opposed, and we are not opposed, for example, to voter ID. What we're opposed to is requiring ID that lots of people don't have. If we want to have a system that is secure and fair that only eligible voters can vote, it's easy to do, but unfortunately, these proposals, and this one is one of them, are crafted in such a way to make it harder for some people to vote. And in addition, more and more, we're seeing rumors spread
gentleman's
by
time's
leaders
expired.
to make people doubt the veracity of their elections.
Thank you. Thanks. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Kerry is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the chairman. I want to thank my dear friend, the ranking member, for doing this hearing today, and I want to thank all of you for traveling in to do this hearing. Ms. Sutherland, I'm going to focus a lot of my questions. A lot of them are going to be parochial, as I am from the state of Ohio, the great state of Ohio. Can you talk a little about your organization's recent report that the 1630 Fund poured almost, if my numbers are correct, or the staff's numbers are correct, roughly $15 million in 8 months in Ohio on different ballot initiatives. Can you kind of just discuss what that was for and where that money came from?
That's right. So the group in question, the 1630 Fund, is the same group that counts Hans-Jörg Wyss as one of their top donors. They've been the beneficiary of about $250 million in foreign cash. 1630 Fund turns around and spends it on a lot of things.
Yeah,
but
so
one of
let me ask you real quick. What is the 1630 Fund? What is it?
The 1630 Fund is a DC-based 501c4.
So it's not Ohio-based?
It is not Ohio-based.
But it's spending all this money in the state of Ohio. Why is that?
So yes, 1630 Fund targeted the state of Ohio to make it easier to amend your state's constitution. And
So again, not an Ohio organization, but an organization that's based out of D.C. that is targeting Ohio. Am I correct with that?
that is correct.
And where are the funders?
Well, their top funders I've outlined is.
Are they coming from Ohio?
They're actually coming from.
Are they not coming from Ohio? That's all I want to know.
They're coming from, one of them is coming from Switzerland, a foreign national.
They are from Switzerland?
Yes.
And you're targeting at Ohio
Yes. So
with
this,
$16 million. How is that? And why is that right?
well, so they are taking advantage of what we have outlaid as this foreign influence loophole where foreign nationals can give to ballot issues both directly and indirectly. And what we have seen is 1630 Fund and their foreign-backed cash targeting Ohio.
Isn't that wrong?
Absolutely.
So let me ask you this. How has the Ohio legislature had any success in moving any legislation forward? I mean, I know these individuals. They're very dear friends of mine. But are they moving any legislation forward that prohibits this conduct by foreign nationals?
I actually had the opportunity just a couple months ago to testify in support of legislation in Ohio that would close this foreign influence loophole to prohibit foreign nationals from contributing to state ballot issues. It actually passed the state Senate, and it was actually recently taken up again. Ohio paired this legislation with getting Biden on the ballot. Unfortunately, every single Democrat in the Ohio state voted to keep Joe Biden off the ballot in favor of keeping the foreign dark money flowing in Ohio.
So we've got two ballot initiatives. One is a redistricting ballot initiative, and one is a minimum wage ballot so they can destroy the restaurants like they did here in D.C. Tell me, do you think that's going to have a big influence in terms of the amount of money that's going to go into the state on these ballot initiatives?
Absolutely. What we also see on these state ballot issues is that they are weaponized and they turn out the vote to shore up the vote to support these liberal-leaning ballot issues and helps the top of the ticket as well.
So let me just, I only have 1 minute and 26 seconds left, but so if Congress or the Ohio legislature does not act to prohibit these national involvement in our state or local ballot initiatives between now and November, and you pretty much said it, but I'm going to let you get another chance at the apple here. This conduct will continue, am I correct?
Absolutely.
So in finalization, can you talk just a little bit about what you're seeing in other states? I mean, I know Ohio, $16 million is a lot of money. But what are we seeing in some of the other states?
We're seeing right now that the 1630 Fund is actively spending in many states. They're actively spending in Ohio, they're actively spending in Missouri, Nevada, and Montana.
Is there any reason, I mean, my goodness, is there any reason that they would be picking these states to spend some money in? What do you think it is?
Yes, if you take a look at the states that the 1630 Fund has targeted for these ballot issues, you can tell that they are key presidential states and often has a competitive U.S. Senate race concurrent with the ballot issue that they are trying to advance.
All right, well, thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Torres is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I think seems like we have forgotten, the fact that the Russians had so much influence in our presidential election, and that the former president and current candidate for president, the Republican nominee, specifically asked the Russians for help in his last election. So here we are again, witnessing another attempt to undermine a free and fair and secure American election by continuing to sow doubt ahead of the 2024 election. I think that we should be clear about the credibility of the Republican witnesses that we have in front of us today. And I ask, Mr. Chairman, for unanimous consent to enter into the record 2 documents. One, an article from NBC headline, "Vote Fraud Crusader J. Christian Adams Sparks Outrage," and an article from the Law and Crime headline, "Former Trump Voting Commissioner Official Forced to Apologize for Falsely Accusing People of Voter Fraud." Mr. Adams has a history of making unfounded allegations about illegal voting, allegations that were so egregious and so damaging to innocent people and families that a federal court had to step in. A federal court in 2016 and 2017, Mr. Adams published 2 reports called Alien Invasion in Virginia that states that thousands of people had illegally registered to vote in Virginia. The report contained an appendix that contained the voter registration forms of alleged non-citizens, including their names, home addresses, and telephone numbers. This blatant attempt to intimidate voters was so egregious that a federal court forced Mr. Adams to provide a written apology on behalf of himself and his organization, PILF. The court also forced PILF to include the following disclaimer. PILF recognizes that individuals in, exhibit whatever, were in fact citizens, and that these citizens did not commit felonies, but were subject to your abuse. PILF profoundly regrets any characterization of those registrants as felons or instances of registration or voting as felonies. It is stunning that this is the type of behavior and witness that we have in front of us today, and that the majority has brought to us, and that these are the witnesses you seem to think have any credibility on any of these issues. Mr. Waldman, it is exhausting to be in this committee dealing with these types of issues. To your knowledge, is there any evidence that non-citizen voting has ever affected the outcome of any election?
I am not aware of any evidence that non-citizen voting has affected the outcome of any federal elections, and I will note that the hearing record that Mr. von Spakovsky keeps waving around is from a quarter century ago, and since then Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, and states happily have vastly improved and greatly upgraded their systems, their voter registration rolls, and the use of computers. Back then, it was paper records. So states and officials of both parties have upgraded, and they shouldn't be subject to calumny.
Absolutely. And what would you estimate the chances of non-citizens voting affecting the outcome of the 2024 upcoming election?
There is no reason to think, based on facts, not intuition, that non-citizen voting will affect the outcome of this or any other federal election of significance.
Like millions of Americans, I was horrified, Mr. Chairman, and disgusted by the violent, deadly attack on the Capitol that happened on January 6, 2021. But what made the attack terrifying was that on top of the threat to our democracy and on top of the threat to the peaceful transfer of power, the violent insurrection targeted us, members of Congress and staff who were here working that day. It is our job as members of this committee to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. Mr. Waldman, is there any connection between the lies that the former president and these witnesses, or some of these witnesses, have stated attempted to steal the 2020 election, and the lies about non-citizens voting that this hearing is spreading today, what would be the impact to this upcoming election?
False allegations about widespread misconduct spurred the January 6th insurrection, even though court after court, 63 courts rejected it. It has spurred unwise voting laws, and I am very worried that it is going to
My
be a
time
factor
is up.
in this
Thank you.
election.
I'm going to yield back, but I'm going to say, should another insurrection occur, it will be at the hands of this committee membership that continues to spread lies about our honest and
The
free
gentlewoman's
elections.
time
And I
has
yield back.
expired. Ms. Lee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for your testimony and for being here with us today. Secretary Byrd, I'd like to return to your testimony and hear more about the specific safeguards that Florida has in place to prevent non-citizens from voting and what the federal government needs to do to help equip state and local election officials to conduct lawful, accurate elections. In 2020, Florida's Constitution was amended to specifically ensure that only U.S. citizens can vote in Florida, correct?
That is correct.
And that passed with over almost 80% of the vote in Florida, isn't that right?
That is actually right.
Now, you testified earlier about something called the SAVE database that is in the possession of the Department of Homeland Security. But you mentioned that it was both overly expensive and inefficient, in essence, for state and local election officials to use. Would you tell us a little bit more about that database and some of the things that make it less than optimal for your use as an elections official?
Thank you. Yes, so the SAVE database is both inefficient due to time and accuracy. It costs states for every transaction, and for some voters, it's multiple transactions, so it's a financial burden on the states to gain information that only the federal government has, that we are compelled as states to comply with under federal law. So by the time an election can come, and before we've had the opportunity to gain all of the information, a non-citizen who made it onto the rolls could gain access to the vote before we have time to remove them.
Would it be helpful if there was not a fee associated with accessing that database?
Absolutely.
And in your opinion, should that database and could that database be more complete and more accurate?
Yes, it should be and more accessible to every state and to local voting administrators.
You also touched on information about when a person is naturalized and then should be an eligible voter. Is that information that is promptly and reliably provided to you as an election official from the federal government?
It is not, and that is one of the things that we are requesting that the Congress consider is making that information available on a regular basis to states, everyone who is naturalized, so we can run that database of new citizens against our existing voter registration roll.
Mr. Adams testified earlier about information that exists in the federal courts when individuals report for jury duty. Is there information there as well that would be useful to you if it were in fact provided to state and local election officials?
Yes, any information that is in the possession of any branch of the federal government regarding citizenship status would be helpful to the states.
Are there other provisions of the NVRA that, in your view, would be helpful if amended?
Most significantly, it is the issue of who has become a naturalized citizen, but also, as you know, as my predecessor, as Secretary of State of Florida, in a presidential election year, which we are in, there are 3 periods. We have a presidential preference primary, the primary in August, and then the election in November. There's a provision in the NVRA that prohibits states from doing certain list maintenance 90 days before each of those elections. That's 270 days out of this presidential election year in which states are prohibited from engaging in certain voter list maintenance activity, and we think that should be stopped.
Thank you, Secretary Byrd. And Mr. Adams, I wanted to return to you. You featured very prominently in some comments just a moment ago. I wanted to give you an opportunity to share your perspective and respond.
Thank you, Representative Lee. First of all, I see Representative Torres as hit and run. This is endemic of cancel culture, where anyone who talks about these issues is attacked. Her recitation of the record was grotesquely inadequate, and in fact, what we published were public records from the Commonwealth of Virginia about non-citizens who were removed from the rolls or purported non-citizens. I have here from Virginia's Department of Elections commentary about our work. It said, "It is worth noting there were some issues that we had with delivery of the DMV non-citizen file. They've since corrected these issues." In other words, we found a problem in Virginia list maintenance involving the improper cancellation of Americans. Representative Torres, were she still here, should be glad that public records have been corrected as a result of these cases that we discovered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. In consultation with the ranking member, we'll each make brief closing remarks before we conclude the hearing. I'll yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate you giving me a couple minutes here just to gather some of my thoughts. And I think one of the reasons I think we're so concerned about this is there are already doubts being cast on the 2024 election by leading Republicans. Senator Lindsey Graham said he would accept the results of the election only if there was no massive cheating, which has never been proven despite claims in 2020 that there was cheating. Earlier this month, two of former President Trump's potential running mates, Senator Tim Scott and Governor Doug Burgum of North Dakota, declined to commit to accepting the results. Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, I saw him on television the other day at CNN, said he would only honor the outcome of the election was free and fair, but Republicans should be ready to pursue any problems. The list goes on. Even my colleague from New York, Representative Stefanik, refused to commit to certify voting results in 2024. Byron Donald said he would not necessarily certify the 2028 election results if he were vice president. It goes on and on. We're panicked because in the 250 years of this country's existence, in this republic, people have routinely, on both sides of the aisle, both sides of any partisan debate, have always accepted election results until 2020, and the former president continues to this day to cast doubts. In fact, one of the things I also wanted to point out is we suggested authorizing up to $5 billion over the next 10 years to put money into state and local elections, to help local election officials and state officials do the job at the best of their ability, and haven't had support for that. Frankly, even the ERIC tool, which is a nonpartisan organization that helps states ensure security and integrity of voter rolls by collecting data from various state sources, including DMVs and election offices, the former president went on a rave about sort of conspiracy-fueled about ERIC and its partisanship with no evidence at all, but because people feel compelled to follow every single thing he says, they have to run like rats out of an aqueduct to try to keep up with the insanity. I have great respect for my colleague, Laurel Lee. She said of ERIC in 2019, when she was Florida Secretary of State, "Joining ERIC keeps Florida at the forefront of election security and will help us ensure a fair and accurate election in 2020 and beyond." I note then, the former president said, "We're not for ERIC anymore." Your successor, who's here, the Secretary of State, caused Florida to leave ERIC, the bipartisan, nonpartisan effort to do this. In fact, even you, Mr. Adams, a witness today, said there was no adequate alternative ERIC, declaring, this is a quote, "There is no replacement right now. People are trying and hoping, and I'm hoping for a Lamborghini." Hopefully you got one, I hope, Mr. Adams, for your sake. You even called out snake oil salesmen pushing the non-existent replacement ERIC. We're desperately concerned about notions that even here we are, 3.5 years later, the former president continuing to insist that there is fraud in a 2020 election despite the countless lawsuits, all the evidence to the contrary, and we're still doing this, which is why we're panicked about 2024. And to say this hearing again, we believe is a pretext for starting to reverse engineer why 2024 we're going to call into question. We don't have any data about it. And frankly, there's so much we can be doing to ensure all Americans vote. And I apologize, I'm taking a few extra seconds here, and I appreciate that. But we're just very, very concerned. And we know, for instance, that the research methodology of the studies referenced by Mr. Van Spakovsky's testimony were immediately and convincingly rebutted upon publication by experts of the survey data used in the study. And it's been a decade now. And in the decade since, the authors of that data have not published a defense of their research that is compelling enough to make it through review, peer review, or surveys of any serious scrutiny. So I think we all know this. I hope my majority colleagues know this. Some people might say that they just don't care. I hope, no, honestly, I pray that this isn't true. As far as I can tell, none of the majority members of this committee, the main committee of jurisdiction for the bill that we're talking about today, attended the Speaker's now infamous press conference to introduce the so-called SAVE Act, an Orwellian name if I've ever heard one. That was last week. As of 10 a.m. this morning, at least according to Congress.gov, only one of the members of this committee has signed on to the bill. I take that as a good sign. I hope this means, at the very least, most of my colleagues on this committee are unwilling to entwine their names for posterity to these obvious lies, to this disgraceful effort to subvert and downgrade our republic. I think they know deep down, as I do, what's happening here, and I think the rest of us know it too. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I thank our witnesses for being here today. I think what we flushed out is the real significant issue that non-citizen voting is playing in instilling confidence in our elections. As we have done over the course of the past 18 months in this committee, we've explored areas where we can improve our confidence in our elections. We did a hearing in Atlanta, Georgia, to show exactly what took place when Georgia passed a voter integrity bill that enhanced integrity in their elections. And contrary to what President Biden claimed and many on the left claimed, what we actually saw was great participation in Georgia. By many analyses, participation actually increasing in the state. The University of Georgia did a comprehensive study of that election, and what we got back was great data that people were actually very pleased with how the elections were conducted and operated, which tells me that as we increase confidence in our election, we actually increase participation. What we've done is flushed out, as Hans von Spakovsky has shown us. This has been an issue that has plagued elections for some time. An election over 20 years ago, this House committee showed numerous non-citizens voting. Then, in more recent era, we have Washington, D.C. aggressively not only allowing non-citizens to vote, in particular for mayor and other key elections in the city, but so much as actively encouraging non-citizens to vote, so much so sending out a postcard at taxpayer expense encouraging non-citizens to vote in our nation's capital. And to do so, one would only need to reside in Washington, D.C. for 30 days. And so as we look at ways to increase Americans' confidence in our elections between now and the November election, I think this should be an area where folks on the left should actually be willing to work with us to make sure that we're addressing these concerns, to maintain that U.S. elections are for U.S. citizens, to remove non-citizens from the voter rolls, to secure our election and increase Americans' confidence in their election, because I believe as we increase confidence in our elections, more individuals are willing to participate, and more participation in our elections is a good thing. Before we leave, I also have a real concern with what the Biden administration has done, in particular as it relates to Executive Order 14019. And what they have done is work to weaponize all federal agencies on behalf of President Biden's reelection campaign. And so I am sending a letter to every cabinet official in the Biden administration, in particular as it relates to this executive order. Our federal agencies should be focused on serving the American people, not focused on reelecting President Biden. And as we see the actions taken by this administration to leverage taxpayer dollars for political purposes, that should be concerning to all citizens. And I look forward to the reply from these letters from every cabinet secretary in the Biden administration. Appreciate all of our witnesses for being here. Appreciate the ranking member and all members of the committee for their participation. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for our witnesses, and we ask you to respond to those questions in writing. Without objection, each member will have 5 legislative days to insert additional material into the record or to revise and extend their remarks. If there's no further business, I want to thank the members for their participation. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.